I was 23 years old, in grad school working towards my MLIS, and working part-time at the West Valley Library. I wasn't paid much at West Valley, so I applied for a position at the larger Stone River Library System, SRLS for short, and was hired there. The new position required me to work hours at the Crestmont and Cherry Lane branches, but I continued working at West Valley as well. My first shift with the SRLS was Monday night, at the Cherry Lane branch. I didn't need much training, because I was already familiar with the software they used and working with the public, but one of my new co-workers was explaining some of the more unique policies this library had, when a patron came up and asked where he could find books about World War II. My co-worker asked if I could handle the question, and I told them that I could. Before the co-worker walked away, though, he jokingly said to the patron, "Take it easy on her, she's pretty new." This patron was heavy-set, and looked to be in his mid to late 40s. I told him he'd want to look at the 940s in the adult nonfiction section, and he wandered away, but several minutes later he came right back. He said that he was having trouble finding the section, and asked if maybe I could help him find the specific book he wanted. I started searching our system for the title he had requested. He then introduced himself to me as Jim, and extended his hand over the desk to shake mine. I awkwardly shook his hand and went back to searching for the book. He was acting a bit overly familiar with me, and he was very talkative, telling me all about himself. Patrons being overly familiar and talkative isn't really unusual in public libraries. Often people come to the library just to have someone to talk to, so we're conditioned to listen to people as we work, as long as it doesn't interfere with providing assistance to other patrons. We didn't own the title he was looking for, but I told him I could place a hold on it and have it sent here from another library. I placed the hold and told him that he would get a phone call when the book arrived here for him. He then told me that the phone number on his account was his home phone, but he would prefer that we call his cell phone. I offered to change the phone number for notifications to call his cell phone number. He said that he didn't want to do that, because his wife wants calls about her books at home. He then suggested that instead, I could take his cell phone number and call him personally when the book arrives. This was a really strange request. I told him that I couldn't do that because I don't handle the items arriving from other libraries, and I'm only here on very part-time hours. He attempted a sad puppy dog face and said, "Come on, please, can't you do it for me?" I told him the best I could do was change the phone number on his account to his cell phone. He declined and didn't press the issue any further. He then asked if I could show him to the 940s in adult nonfiction. I walked across the library to the 940 section with him. I don't remember our conversation amongst the stacks, but he was clearly trying to flirt with me, and at some point he said something along the lines of, "You look so young, but you really seem to know what you're doing. It's hard to believe you're new here." I told him that I was new to this library system, but that I'd worked at another nearby for several months, and that I also work at another branch in this library system. He then dropped all pretense of looking for World War II books and started grilling me with personal questions. I tried to sidestep them as best as I could, and completely made up the few things I did tell him, but I've always had trouble politely disengaging from uncomfortable conversations like this. After 15 minutes, I told him that the library was really busy tonight, and that I needed to get back to the circulation desk. As I turned to walk out of the aisle, he grabbed my wrist to stop me, held it very tightly, and said, "You should give me your number." I was completely shaken that he'd grabbed me, and I wasn't concerned about being polite anymore. I semi-screamed, "No, I'm not interested," and yanked my arm out of his grasp. I power-walked back up to the circulation desk and into the staff room, where I then caught shit from the supervisor on duty for disappearing for almost 20 minutes. By the time my chat with the supervisor was over, Jim had already left the library. I quickly went back to the computer where I placed the hold for him, opened the transaction log, and opened his library account from there. I wrote down his card number, his full name, and his address. The next day was my first day of work at the Crestmont branch. It was pretty uneventful. Thursday I worked at the Crestmont branch again. When I arrived, the supervisor told me that someone called looking for me on Wednesday, but didn't want to leave a message. I had no idea who it could have been, so I just shrugged it off. Later that day, a coworker told me there was someone on the phone for me. I picked up the call, and it was Jim. He said he was just calling to talk. This had the hair on the back of my neck standing up, because I realized that he must have been the person who called looking for me yesterday. I told him that I can't just talk to people on the phone while I'm at work, and to not call here again. He said if I gave him my cell number, he could call me when I'm not at work and we could talk. I told him that I'm not interested again, and I hung up the phone. The supervisor, overhearing this, asked what had happened, and I explained what had happened at the Cherry Lane branch. She wrote up an incident report about everything, which he sent to the director of SRLS and the supervisors at all 4 branches. Friday afternoon, though, the director of SRLS called me at home. He told me that Jim had apparently called all 4 of the branches on Wednesday and showed up at one branch trying to find me, asking where and when I would be working next. The director emailed me a letter, drafted by the SRLS's lawyer, that he planned to send Jim and asked me to read it over to make sure everything was accurate. The letter summarized the incidents from Cherry Lane on Monday and Crestmont on Thursday, warned Jim that library patrons are not permitted to interfere with a library employee while she's performing her duties, and went on to say, if it were not apparent from the employee's tone of voice, I want to make it clear that your personal attention directed at her is unwanted. It's expected that you will not continue to seek out interactions with this employee. All future interactions you have with library employees will be based upon library services and not become personal. Failure to comply will result in you being banned from the system for a period of time commensurate to your misconduct. I told the director that I thought this might be a little bit harsh. I could just be overreacting about the whole situation. But he said that everything about Jim's interactions with me had been inappropriate, and he wanted to put a stop to this right now. I agreed that he should send the letter. On Sunday, I worked at the West Valley Library. Shortly after the library opened, I answered a phone call, and it was Jim. I was shocked and scared, because I'd never told him that I worked at this library. He said that he really wanted to see me, and if I wouldn't talk on the phone, he would come to the library so we could talk in person. I wanted to be completely clear, so I told him that I was sorry if I gave him the wrong impression, but I wasn't interested in talking to him on the phone or in person, or ever again at all. He started yelling, saying things like, I thought you were a good person. You seem so nice. You shouldn't treat me like this. I said I had to go and immediately hung up the phone. A coworker who overheard the conversation convinced me to file a police report just in case. The police arrived shortly after that, and I sat down with them and went over everything. They told me that they were going to stop by Jim's house the next day to speak with him about the situation and see where things stand. They told me that if I see him following me anywhere, I should call 911 immediately. Monday night, I worked at the Cherry Lane branch again. I was kind of nervous that Jim might come in since he knew I would be working there, and because he had probably just received a warning letter from my boss and a visit from the police. But he didn't show up. My coworkers and I walked to the staff parking lot together after closing, and as we approached our cars, I saw that my car's hood had been popped. We got closer, and I saw that all 4 windows plus the front and rear windshields had been smashed in. There were also dozens of deep dents to the metal panels, and cracks and holes punched through the bumpers and other plastic sections of my car. Inside, it looked like someone had poured bleach all over the black cloth seats. Before I could even process what I was looking at, My legs stopped supporting me. I collapsed onto the blacktop and immediately threw up. This is the first and only time in my life I've experienced actual panic. My coworkers hoisted me back up and dragged me back to the library where they called 911. When the police arrived, I told them about Jim. They located Jim's car several blocks away, and inside it they found empty bleach containers, a hammer, and a full set of his clothing: shoes, socks, pants, underwear, a shirt, and a sweater. When they visited his house, his wife told the police that he was at a local bar watching a football game. The police were never able to locate Jim, and as far as I understand, he never returned to his house or his wife. I didn't stick around to find out, though. Over the next 2 days, I quit both of my jobs, dropped out of school, broke my apartment lease, and moved several hundred miles away. But now I carry pepper spray. I'm a black belt in Krav Maga, and I don't run from threats anymore. This happened a couple of years ago, but I feel like I'm ready to talk about it. In 2016, I had just turned 18 and was in the second semester of community college. I was lucky to get to take a few specialized classes that were requirements for my major. These classes required me to drive about 45 minutes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to the main campus of my community college system. This is relevant because I was going to a town that I barely knew much about, and I didn't know anybody who lived there. There was a man in my class named Eddie. He was a big guy in his late 40s. I'm 5'0", and at the time was about 130 pounds, which is to say I'm pretty small and defenseless. We spent a lot of time in the lab for these classes, and he was stationed right across from me. I was a bit more naive and unsuspecting at the time, and wanted to be nice, so I talked with him and my other classmates quite a bit, and was a lot friendlier to him than I would be nowadays. He started being overly friendly to me, and would stand too close and ask too many personal questions. He'd flirt with me in class, to the point it seemed to make the other people uncomfortable to watch. He also started staring at me a lot, with an intense look that really scared me. Of course, being young and not wanting to hurt his feelings, I decided to try and ignore it as best I could. I told my boyfriend about it, but again, Eddie hadn't actually done anything to me, so there wasn't a lot I felt I could do. A few weeks after that all started, all of us were hanging out in a break room type area, studying for an exam in our next class, which was about 30 minutes away. I was sitting at one table, chatting with some middle-aged woman in my class, and Eddie was at the next table over messing with his phone. I announced that I was going to get something from the vending machine and stood up. As I did, he tried, and failed, to discreetly turn his phone toward me and snapped pictures of me as I walked to the machine, got my drink, and bent over to pick it up. I realized what was going on as I was walking back to my seat, with him still taking photos, and I shot him a dirty look. He put his phone away and just sat there staring at me. I was trying to look pissed, but honestly I was just really freaked out. I excused myself from the table and called my boyfriend, near in tears, telling him what had happened. He was angry, and said that I needed to tell someone, but I said no. I didn't want to make a scene. He tried to comfort me as much as he could, but I had to go to class soon afterwards. Our class finished at about 9 p.m., and since it was January, it was completely dark out when we all walked to our cars. I was actually texting one of my guy friends about what had happened when Eddie walked up to my car. He stopped for a second and looked at me through my windshield, then slowly kept walking, watching me through my driver's side window the whole time. He was parked nowhere near me, and the wind chill was below 0, so he had to have made a point to walk by my car like that. I was terrified, and with my hands shaking I started my car and drove home as fast as I could, calling my boyfriend on the way and crying. After that, I decided I needed to talk to my professor about what was going on. I was so nervous, but I asked her the next week if I could talk to her privately when class was over. We went to her office and I told her about Eddie and what he had done, how he had acted so weird towards me. She told me that she had noticed I tensed up and went quiet whenever he got close to me, and had noticed him paying a lot of attention to me. She told me she believed me about the pictures. It was honestly amazing how she handled it. She promised me that she would move things around where I'd be away from him in the lab, and asked if I wanted her to talk to him about it. I said no, that I didn't want to make him angry, and she said she'd respect that, but she was going to have the security guard stand at the door and watch me go to my car every night, and that she'd tell the program director what was going on, but Eddie wouldn't know that I'd talked to her. By the time we got done, it had been about 30 minutes since class had ended, and she offered to walk me outside. I'm glad that she did, because when we came out of the elevator to the first floor, Eddie was sitting in the foyer alone. Everybody else had gone home long ago. My blood ran cold, but I tried to act as normal as I could. He seemed as surprised to see our professor there as she was to see him. She asked why he was still here, and he said he noticed my car was still parked out front and wanted to make sure I didn't have to walk out myself. I'm pretty sure I was as pale as a ghost, but my professor gave him a look that I couldn't read and said not to worry. She was walking me to my car, and from now on the security guard would be there every night. He said that was good and quickly left and said good night. It still chills me to think about what would have happened if my professor didn't walk me down to my car that night. I have no idea what he was capable of doing. After this, she rearranged our seating and made sure we were never grouped together, and I started making sure I walked out to my car at the same time as a few other women in my class. The security guard was usually in the foyer, and we only had a couple months left of class, so there wasn't really any time for other incidents, but I still caught him staring at me sometimes, and he looked like he was full of rage. It's been a few years. I don't go to that school anymore, and I'm moving to a completely different city soon. Not long ago, my partner and I were driving through a reservation land at about 11 o'clock at night, in the desert southwest of the USA. We were on a major highway, but as with so many highways in that area, it's not very well used, just barely paved, and with only one lane going in each direction. No lights, just reflectors embedded in the pavement. It's not uncommon to go for an hour on this highway without ever seeing another vehicle. I was reading a book aloud when suddenly my buddy, who was driving, interrupts and pulls off on the side of the road, braking quickly. "Did you see that?" "No," I replied. "See what?" "That van, it just went off the road." I turned in my seat, but couldn't make out anything, on or off the road. It was just darkness all around. He grabbed the flashlight that we keep in the car and asked me to call 911 right away. He's in a medical profession and a lapsed licensed EMT, and I've worked in emergency response, so this isn't a super uncommon occurrence for us, although not even being able to see the accident was a first for me. I got on the phone with 911 immediately and set about trying to find a mile marker using my phone as a flashlight, eventually settling for giving them approximate GPS coordinates, as I had very little coverage and my GPS was acting flighty in that area. The dispatcher asked me to cross the highway carefully and try to ascertain the status of the passengers, since they had gone straight over a hill and presumably into the canyon below. I stayed on the line while I trudged over the sand dunes on the opposite side of the highway. I was a bit nervous to be walking this area in sandals, as we had just recently been discussing the rattlesnake population in the region. I couldn't really see where I was going and answer the dispatcher questions at the same time, but the scrubby vegetation gave me some purchase. Finally, I crested the largest dune, and I could see the outline of the accident site. On the road, The moonlight was blocked by the dunes, but on this side it was strangely bright. It took my brain a moment to make sense of what I was seeing. They had been lucky. The van had turned on its side and slid, and the friction from the dunes had just barely prevented the entire thing from going over the edge into the massive canyon below. My partner called out to me and asked me to check on the woman in the van, and I saw that next to him, standing with scarecrow-like stiffness, was a young man. He looked dazed and didn't seem to be answering any questions. I got the darkest vibe off of that guy that I've ever encountered. I felt goosebumps crawling up my back, and it was like there was a permanent ring of shadows around him. I felt very uneasy, knowing that either of us were anywhere near him, and made a point to keep visually checking up on them. I proceeded to the site and around the van, and called out to identify myself. I heard the voice of a woman inside, and as I walked around the windshield I could see her. She was crouched in the passenger cabin, clearly in shock, her feet bleeding as she shifted back and forth in the broken glass of the driver's side window. A tall, willowy woman, thin and pale with dark hair. There was also a massive wolfhound panting. It appeared equally stunned. I saw that they had managed to pry the passenger side door open, and the man must have climbed out to the top that way. The woman spoke with me for a time, calmly and with an urgency I couldn't quite identify in her voice, and I relayed the information to the dispatcher. Yes, it was just the two of them. No, they don't seem to be seriously injured. Nobody had fallen asleep at the wheel. They were on their way to Texas to visit family. They were living out of the van. What I remember most clearly is that I made a couple of attempts to convince her to climb out of the roof or through the back to clear away from the van just to be safe, but she refused each time. She said that she didn't want to leave the dog. There was something wrong about her demeanor. People react differently to stress, and she seemed alert and competent, so I put it in the back of my mind. But I kept being struck by a strangeness in her handling of the situation. Dispatch and I agreed that the paramedics could probably easily break the windshield to free them, and there was no sign of fuel, so it was fine for her to stay in there until they arrived. Once I double-checked that she was secure and wasn't going anywhere, I handed off the phone to my partner while I went to wave out the paramedics. They had accidentally passed the site and were backing towards us from farther up the highway, looking for our flashlight thanks to the dispatcher. They pulled up a ways from the site, and I began to brief them. We all heard dispatch come over the radio. Please be advised that the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous. AMS stands for altered mental status, suggesting that someone isn't in the normal frame of mind for any variety of reasons. We all stopped in our tracks. The paramedics exchanged a glance, and one went back to the ambulance for additional equipment. I was eager to get back to my partner to make sure he hadn't communicated that to dispatch out of concern for his safety, but when we arrived on site, they were still talking quietly. I went to my car to find shoes for the woman. The passengers were placed in different ambulances, and the police arrived to take interviews all around. Just as we were about to leave, an officer taking our statements turned to us and says, "It's real messed up. I guess she was driving and he wanted to kill them both, so he grabbed the wheel and overpowered her. It's lucky either of them are alive." After a couple of hours, when we were back to driving, my partner proceeded to fill in the details. When he first got to the scene, the woman was yelling that he had tried to kill her and to please not leave her alone with him. She also said that if he got out, he needed to be restrained and that he was a danger to himself and others. The man was very eager to be let out of the vehicle. Bewildered, my partner had nonetheless helped the guy pry the door open, and once he was out, the guy had just clammed up and wouldn't do much more than nod or shake his head in response to anything. He kept fearing that the guy might take off and get lost in the desert, but in the end he had waited. He said the guy had seemed agitated, so he was doing his best to keep him engaged and distracted until help could arrive. It was chilling to realize that what we had thought was an accident was actually a murder-suicide attempt. I really wanted to accompany the woman to the hospital, but for unrelated reasons we couldn't remain. We went back that way during the day on a return trip a week later. We pulled over at the side and climbed over the dunes to see whether they had managed to tow the van over all that sand, and sure enough it was gone. What was unnerving was the realization, upon seeing the landscape during the day, that if he had chosen any other spot to grab the wheel, for miles in both directions, they would have gone over the cliff almost instantly. In the dark there was no way for him to tell, but he had chosen the only spot where they could have survived the incident. My partner then told me they had gone off the road when they were nearly opposite our little sedan on the highway. If the guy had opted for a head-on collision instead of the off-the-cliff option, we would have both been toast. It was a sobering thought. I think of the woman I met that night often, and of her wolfhound being gingerly coaxed into the back of the police car. I really hope that they're in a much better place now. As for the guy who tried to kill them all, I certainly hope that he gets the help he needs.